Hello and welcome back to the Healthtech Pigeon podcast, brought to you by SomX. And there is a very big topic on everybody's lips this week. But before we jump into it, I'd like to introduce you to my guests who are going to help us navigate this discussion. Liam, Malte, Hugh, thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing? How's your week been? Let's not get into the plan and how that's made you feel just yet. Tell me about something else in your week, because something else surely has happened. Liam, what have you been up to?
I've been so first half of this week I've been like full of anxiety because I couldn't get rid of my brain fog after COVID the week before, and I don't know if you had that, but just really dragging myself through work initially. Fortunately, it came back. The brain came back by Thursday, but I just anxiety filled week, right? In solidarity with the Chancellor, I had a few cries during that period, right?
I'm sure he did too. Glad you're feeling better though. Malte, how about you? How's your week been?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. It's been a super busy week with the plan coming out, and I've had a busy Friday interviewing, etc. So haven't really stopped. But I think my enjoyment the week is that our daughter, who is 7.5, she's just properly getting into Harry Potter. So every evening when I get home, the most exciting moment is going to bed because she actually wants to go to bed early and have some Harry Potter read to her. Turns out my wife is better at reading it than I am, apparently, but I'm allowed to sit there and listen because I actually have never read the books, which I know is terrible. So if I get double, I get the joy of her and actually listening to it. So yeah, that basically makes me happy all the time at the moment.
Oh, that's so lovely. And I don't want to jump into the NHS 10-year plan just yet, but on the topic of Harry Potter, I did see Sam Alsop-Hall refer to the NHS 10-year plan as Harry Potter 9. So maybe that is, once you've completed the official series, maybe you're up with the final installation. And
can we finish with who's got the best the best Harry Potter title by the end of this session, right?
Yes, 100%. 100%. Hugh, what about you? What have you been up to? What's been keeping you busy?
Oh, super busy week. I just nod to Liam's as dragging yourself through the week sometimes. Mum is out of hospital, which is a good thing on the personal side. So, I think everything else just takes a backseat to that. Other than the 10-year plan, which is obviously what I've been thinking about nonstop since way before it came out.
Oh, we are delighted to hear that your mum is out of hospital. I think we've all done very well to reach, how many minutes are we now? Nearly 3 minutes into the podcast. And we haven't yet mentioned the great British weather that has descended upon us this week because we've been so distracted by the NHS 10-year plan. We've basically forgotten that we've been living in a sauna for a couple of days. But I'm glad we all survived and made it to this point. And now we're actually not talking about the weather anymore.
Yeah, but also, Jessica, to be clear, it's a lovely week. And tomorrow, and I would actually love to get on my bike, it's meant to rain. So it's still not getting it quite right, the weather for me, I'm afraid. Yeah.
I'd say I'd have understood more of the 10-year plan if it hadn't been quite as hot while I was reading it.
Yeah, maybe. Perhaps it is. Perhaps it's one for the weekends while it's raining. Then we can really get into the detail and get into some of those references and appendices. Anyway,
no, I'm not touching that damn plan over the weekend. Going to be watching the rugby.
Fair. I think that's a reasonable alternative, and then we'll see how we feel come Monday whether we want to come back to it. Well, all right. Let's get into it then. It's fair to say it's a big old report. LinkedIn is amok with summaries. I've seen numerous posts that were basically, I'm just waiting for Liam's summary. So here we are. And one thing that actually did make me laugh is, in one breath, I was like, everyone is talking about the NHS 10-year plan. And then earlier today, I bumped into some of our mum friends, and they weren't talking about the NHS 10-year plan. It hasn't even crossed their radar. And it really just made me laugh to myself, because something that has felt very consuming this week, that feels like truly everyone's talking about it, most people actually aren't. And it's nice that we're getting riled up and excited about it, but actually it hasn't made particularly big waves outside of the sector and the industry. For most people, it's just another policy, it's just another report. But why do we think this one might not just be another report, and there might be something something worthwhile reading into it. Anyone particularly excited?
But Jessica, sorry, just on your point around the waves, right? It's also been a very interesting observation of the last few days how politics plays with these announcements, right? Because you had the welfare cuts, you had the political fallout from that. I think you've then seen a very carefully staged, trailing of lots of information about the plan and the final result of it coming out, which suddenly became a much bigger political event because it had to counteract previous events and how the media was representing them, not judging any of that. So I found it a fascinating week also from a sort of political communication perspective, not just the content of the plan
That
itself.
is such a good point, because actually although we had the papers obviously reporting on the plan slightly ahead of us actually seeing its full publication, we kind of almost had full sight of what was in it prior to that because of all the leaks and the early sight of it that the media had reporting on certain elements of it. Really, it was a contents page we were waiting for, and we'd seen most of the elements that make up the constituent parts. But I think that's a really good point, that it's definitely been well choreographed and it's certainly been stage managed. It's a stage managed week.
Yeah, has it been well stage managed?
I think well, I was being generous. I think well might have been slightly generous, but I think it's been managed.
All I can say is that I had to try and put aside my thoughts before starting to read it that it was a discombobulated mess of stuff. Not because of what the HSJ said, but just generally, we've had it served to us in like little tiny bits, and we've already formed opinions. But actually, I sat down and said, all right, I'm going to put this aside. I'm going to try and look at it at face value and look at it and not think about all of the things that everyone's been commenting on for weeks. Because otherwise people think it's a jumble of stuff. But I think the jumble of stuff is what preceded it. And I think there's a danger in how it was managed. And I don't know. I don't know whether that was a damage limitation exercise. Like, we could get into politics, like, who knows? But like whether the way that it was managed was a damage limitation exercise or it was just reeling back from a genuine leak, like who knows, right? But it didn't feel very well coordinated to me, to be totally honest. Like, I don't think everyone was really excited and full of goodwill when it came out.
Well, there's also an element of it's been coming for a very long time, right? And certainly for the sort of more policy wonkery side, like us, that the more you engage with something, by the time it finally happens, it sort of feels in a different space.
It's like waiting for an album to drop when they've done all the singles.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, it's exactly that. It's exactly that, and I think you're right as well, because it's been talked about as a very visionary piece, and I think when it's being leaked out or dripped out in these small kind of bite-sized pieces, it's very easy to see how that looks really muddled, because ultimately it is missing the big piece that joins it all together, which is the big vision. And because there isn't a lot in it on the delivery side of things, then it is a bit anticlimactic, I suppose, in that way.
I think I was surprised to see as well from a lot of the stuff, as you said, that had come out beforehand, and there's a lot of it drip fed. But when you look into the plan, and for some of these things, even where there's been quite large press releases, quite large announcements, and a lot of sort of management around kind of individual pieces, there was almost more detail in the announcement than there was in the plan on several of those kind of key points. And I think, I'm sort of waiting for the announcement for each and every other point to come out over the next few years, so that we get that a bit of detail. If we can have as much detail as about some of the kind of more interesting points as we have, the app, or what they're intended to do with the innovator passport, or I think someone pointed out it's a 20-page press release for the neighborhood, the new neighborhood approach. But they put so much effort into actually carefully managing these individual announcements that when it did come, it's sort of, this feels like a list of things now rather than necessarily a kind of visionary piece.
I'm just going to say I enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed sitting down and finally piecing all the bits together and seeing how it was cohesive. Like, regardless of how I felt about certain elements, I just liked sitting down and spending a morning really working through it, right? Like, because it's really important. It's it is. Whether we like it or not, whether we agree or disagree, it is the blueprint for what's going to happen next. And yes, there might be iterations and political changes and so on, but you know, like it's good to see what people are going to be thinking about and talking about going forward. Like it's quite a monumental thing for those of us who are long termers in the service. You know,
I'm actually really positive about it. I know it's sort of really easy to be down about it in terms of the delivery component. How is a lot of this going to work? How clear is the future vision? You know, so how coherent, as you just described, the singles versus the album, which is awesome. And yes, you know, there's been lots of 10-year plans, 5-year plans, forward vision, you know, sort of, etc. But you know, I think it's mostly stepping much more into a picture of what the care of the future should look like than past plans we have seen. And it's quite easy to be cynical about, oh, will robotics really do this? Will the app really do that? Will we really have a doctor in our pocket? And that there's a sort of certain amount of how you articulate this. But I think for quite some time, the service has been missing a clearer sense of that the future has to look very different. It has to look very technical and very digital. And it's quite hard to describe that as a time where you don't quite know yet what it's going to look like or how it's going to work. So you end up with describing the things that you have today, and then it's easy to poke holes into that.
Yeah.
But I actually feel that sort of that sense of, all right, let's actually step into that future and let's make it work, whether I agree with the 5 big bets or certain aspects or not, or sort of otherwise, is really, really positive to make that work, and also sets the signal that we want it to look different, notwithstanding all the sort of challenges around what that looks like. You know, have neighborhood and health services been there before? Polyclinics, absolutely. You know, has Aradazi been talking about polyclinics for quite a long time? Yes, absolutely. At the same time, trying to conceive of them as what they would look like if you generally move care into the community, and if you try and digitally enable it, maybe not quite described as digital first in the plan. I think it's very powerful. So from that perspective, Liam, I agree. I sort of enjoyed reading it and thinking, actually, that maybe not how I would have written it, but then I didn't write it, right? So that I think it's positive in that perspective.
Yeah, and like for your listeners, right? Because I think there's one of the things I've seen this week is a lot of people going, I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to go and pick a couple of people I'm going to listen to about it, and just kind of and you know, and they might have there's not enough detail or damning view and so on, but actually, like, the future hasn't been built yet, and we're all muddling around trying to work out how the hell we do it, right? There's no blueprint. There is no digital revolution guide for dummies. It doesn't exist, right? And we've got to cobble our way through as a collection of people. And actually, like, being able to, you know, I think people should read it and see how they feel about it. Like, if the one thing I recommend to any listener on this is go and read it, and just, maybe you don't feel like you're going to be an expert in it. Maybe a lot of it's confusing, but try and see what resonates and what you feel, because this is a shared project, this whole thing, right? It's our shared project together.
Well, it's going to be, you know, potentially the legacy for this government, isn't it? You know, we've been talking about the need for NHS reform, transforming the NHS for the longest time, and we've seen piecemeal attempts, but you know, it is ultimately what people have been asking for and calling for. And you're right when you say we don't know what the future is going to look like, so it is really hard to build from it, but we also know what the challenges are that exist, and we need to actually figure out ways to fix them that are actually going to fix them, rather than being a sticking plaster. And I think a lot of what we've seen so far has been sticking plasters, rather than trying to figure out what that vision is and working back from there. So, I mean, maybe that's the direction that they're going in. But I think it's clear that the government certainly, and I think the industry sees how important this is to set out the start of it, even if it's not totally clear, the start of what that roadmap is going to look like. And, you know, some of it will be a wait and see, but hopefully we're starting to get a flavour for it, and we're still in a position where hopefully, you know, we can influence what that looks like.
There's also, Jessica, I think an undertone across the report, and maybe how it's been spoken about, talked about in the announcements and speeches, which is a greater expectation of, you know, we're setting out our stall here, and we want to have a conversation about how you, industry, society, think tanks, you know, how are you going to work with us to make that happen? And I can feel a little bit challenging, but I also think it's actually a shift that was needed, with a clearer sense of this is what we're trying to achieve, and how can all of those partner stakeholders come together to make that happen? Because I think aspects of the NHS have been led by various stakeholders in the direction that they wanted to. You know, there's been conversations around how much of tech solutions are industry led versus sort of problem led, for example, in that way. And so I think also that undertone, which can maybe sound a bit more challenging about, okay, how are we going to make this happen? How do you help us when it comes from the government? Is probably the right direction to go. And as Liam says, sort of actually, how do we all muck into this? And I think that's our job now, wherever we sit, to make it work.
So do you think that undertone of collaboration and the intention of bringing those stakeholders along on that journey and helping them shape allowing them to help shape what this looks like, do you think that is genuine? Do you think that, or that's lip service? Do you think, because I anticipate that there's no way through this other than through collaboration, but there are obviously skeptics out there who will say that, decisions have already been made. We've seen a lot of cronyism, we've seen backhanders and all of that kind of thing. Do you think that the earnest is there for that collaboration to bring the right stakeholders along on that journey to shape it in the way that it needs to be for the people who it needs to look like that for?
Can I sidecar onto that question, because I'm really interested in Malte's view on something? Because obviously there's definitely willingness for a conversation that's been illustrated. In terms of the toning that you've seen in the paper, do you think the conversation is with all of industry, or that it seems to be largely led by big industry? And that is a very leading question on my behalf, I appreciate. But I felt like the little guys and the startups seem to be hugely underrepresented there. And I'd love to know if you feel any different, or if you've seen it, I don't know if you've read it a different way.
Yeah, I guess my starting point with that question, and also Jessica, your point around, how collaborative is this? Maybe the word I would describe or use more in the sort of, the plan is more demanding of stakeholders to be part of this direction, how we're going to solve this. And the reason I maybe use demanding is because I think in some instances, what that will mean is that the government might be more willing to ultimately make a big bet, or make a big procurement, or make a national prioritization decision to push something forward. And it's interesting that they use the language of big bets, though that's pretty big, broad areas in the plan, not very sort of specific things. And so, coming to your question then, Liam, I expect that if you think about it sort of from being demanding, that there will be areas where they're more likely to push for certain solutions. Now, it's not for me to say whether that means national procurement, or whether there'll be a framework with some solutions on it, which then inevitably can sort of lead to those imbalances between different sort of industry partners. But so I do foresee there to be some sectors where it's going to become more national, whether it's decision prioritization or procurement, and then other areas where it's more open. And so the key question for me from that perspective is the starting point. We're gonna set out a problem we want to work on. We're gonna develop, if you want, a model or a blueprint of what we expect all parts of the NHS to do, and then we're going to invite industry partners to show how they can do that, and there'll be a framework, sort of to draw on. And that might not happen straight away. You might have to work with one or two partners to develop this in a small number of areas, and then we sort of open that framework up. Or does it look like a sort of national procurement exercise? And that I can't see. And the other bit is that or I can't see yet. The other bit is that in the part of the plan that talks a lot around innovation and adoption of innovation. Really, really good to see how much it emphasizes adoption. Though some of the details sort of yet to be seen around innovation landing zones and global institutes for innovation, etc. I think there's potentially a lot of opportunities for startups and SME to play a role in that. But I don't think it's going to happen if the way that funding is being made available, or the sort of procurement roles are sort of going to happen through that sort of approaches being developed primarily, with that explicitly in mind. And I think that's yet to be seen, Liam.
That's interesting, because for the sake of debate, I had this overwhelming feeling that this was all about the big guys and the big life sciences providers, and the IBMs, the other big tech companies that are going to be kind of leaning into this. And I kind of felt that, because if this lovely story we have, for example, in the clinical entrepreneurship program, that you're a doctor with an idea and we'll help you understand how to run a business, and then you'll build it up and you'll get funding. And there's a lot of companies here which arguably, like if we just look at the digital scribes companies, right, they've all come from smaller companies, right? And like now we're raving about this, but that wasn't big tech. That wasn't IBM Watson that came up with this. This was a bunch of bunch of doctors and clinical leaders generally in a lot of these who've kind of come up with this side of things. And I personally have this feeling that the way that process will transpire is going to be that you're going to have to push very hard to kind of get into this zone. There's some enticing things, but I worry that the immediate consequences is going to be people who just don't have the firepower to be able to kind of get into it. And it's always the concern about centralization, right? So like I'm worried on behalf of the startups, like, and I think there's things that look good to them, but my cynicism makes me worry about when it gets pragmatic about whether it will just be dominated by the big players. And I don't know, like that's my concern.
I do think that at the moment we don't necessarily have a good articulation about what the type of technology or enablers are that you should generally look at from a national perspective, whether that means a national procurement or a framework that's really nationally driven, and where you keep that more open. You set the expectation on the framework and you say actually everyone has to do this, but so what does that look like? And it'd be interesting to see how through the plan where that balance will fall. I think another example in this place, I think, is the part in the plan, and that was trailed, that for some priority areas, NICE will be able to provide approval, and then there will be reimbursement for some digital therapeutics or other solutions. And they've been very clear that will only be in certain priority areas set by the government. I think it's probably right. You can't immediately move to a digital reimbursement for everything. You have to be quite sort of clear in that way. I think there it could look quite different, right? Because who provides that particular sort of therapeutic, particularly if it's an app or similar, might not have the same dynamic as you have it, for things like patient records or the sort of infrastructure space. But yeah, it's a good and probably open question still, Liam.
Jess and Hugh, you might have to police us out of geekery if we start getting into it, right? Geeky wonkery, right? This is what happens. You've got two people who fixate on this stuff all the time, right?
No, not at all. I mean, it's every day's a school day, right? And I think it's good to hear the debate, and it's good to hear the concerns. And I think it's conversations that we need to have. And if you're feeling that, and you both have, those perspectives, there are going to be other people who are going to be asking those questions too. And I think they need to be answered. And I think also what probably doesn't help is this kind of ambiguity at the centre with, what's happening in NHS England and how is that going to look. I think there's a lot of leadership ambiguity that doesn't help with people's confidence around decision making. And I think that also leaves a lot of questions that are yet to be answered, and anxiety and nervousness.
There's probably also something around transparency, right? I mean, I'm not a procurement expert, but on the face of it, I think there's nothing wrong for a government to say that in order to really make progress, we're really going to drive something through, for example, national procurement or a more nationalized or sort of centralized approach to this. And ultimately, that approach will mean that there is some losers and some big winners, at least for a period of time, depending on how you set that out. Being transparent where you do that and why you do that, and why it matters in this space and why you're not doing it in others, I think they'd like to sort of set a clear parameters so that if you are in a startup and you do understand, might not like it, but you do understand why in that space, the government sort of decides to go much more narrow to make that happen. And in the same way that a big business or, is likely to make quite focused and narrow decisions on some things, they want to drive across the whole business straight away rather than work with or trial out. But that sense of transparency and what the principles are, I think that could be very helpful over time.
Yeah, I guess my concern is, and hopefully this will kind of be rooted out in the kind of sort of institutional centrism that's kind of happened over years, right? But my concern always is, and my concern with the SPR as well, which I think a lot of people have kind of voiced, is that there might be some very big specific suppliers who can give the centre the confidence that they can build something, and that they have the capability and the infrastructure to be able to build this thing. But actually, that you almost forget that some of the capabilities they're looking to do already exist in the market and have existed for many years, not as a central function. And it does, like, you know, and obviously we haven't got into the NHS app yet, but like, it does kind of worry me that maybe there are some things in the national vision where they've kind of managed to, or there's a risk that and again, you mentioned transparency, that there's a risk that someone who has not done it, but makes a central authority feel confident, is going to take precedent in a decision-making process over a company that has actually like built out and created a market and helped people see what is possible in this. And, you know, I'm not going to name any companies on either side of this, because I think, you know, those in the know will kind of have an idea of certain players within that. But I think we just need to have really good, as Malte says, like transparency. Like, I think we need to have the confidence, because otherwise that shakes the market. Like, if you go and build something for years and then the government comes and says, this is our big vision and we're going to pay someone to do it. And then, I don't know, like one of the big lot 4 providers, there's a small group of providers who are on the list to be able to do tech things. They get all the contract because they're seen as the only ones who have the capability. Then like that sends a clear message. And I worry about that.
Another point on your question around collaboration, Jessica, where you kicked Liam and I off with sort of with that. But I particularly in some of the new areas that described, maybe single patient record is a difficult one because that's, you know, sort of potential more sort of a national approach. But in other areas, to generally try and work with a series of industry partners about what good looks like, right? And so ambient scribes are the example there for me, because there's obviously so many vendors, suppliers now out there in the NHS working with it, and the ability to actually engage with not just the practitioners, care staff who are, you know, already working with ambient scribes, but also the suppliers, and bring them together and say, what does good actually look like? Because we don't really know yet what good looks like around that. I mean, we know certain aspects around sort of compliance and what works and what doesn't work, but in terms of how you really realize the benefits from it, how you evaluate it well, how you engage with people well, what the tools and templates look like. And if we generally want to make that happen nationally, leaving aside for a moment the point around, you know, how you procure to provide the national framework, I think they say national framework in the plan for this, don't they? Actually, how you create that community of people together saying, what is the best way to implement this type of technology so that benefits staff and patients, can be incredibly powerful. We want to try something like this institute in Cambridge is going to work with us, or rather we're going to work with them, the Health Foundation, to actually set up a sort of implementation community around ambient scribes. And the idea is that you actually get all the practitioners working on this to have a conversation about what works, what doesn't work, have a much more standardized approach to evaluation, so you make it easier to understand where it works and why it doesn't work, which I think is potentially very exciting because it's for the benefit of the NHS, but it also does mean that a different way of collaborating across organizational boundaries and potentially industry boundaries to make that happen.
I think also to Liam's point, you know, and to yours actually, about this sort of bringing experts and I guess also the people that it affects, but the people who are doing this into a room together to figure out how to do it well and learn from the experience. Because if you end up with a big organization, as Liam describes, and one of the big 4 organizations coming in who have perhaps not, when you take the NHS app, for example, and the list of features that have been sort of included in this plan, those big companies haven't successfully been able to deploy the technologies that allow for this kind of functionality. But there are some really phenomenal players in the space who are already doing such a good job, who have got that expertise around how to deploy and how to get that adoption, and have been able to connect up patients and clinicians and, you know, hospital organizations and other healthcare organizations as well. That expertise, that knowledge exists, and so those people and those players, they should be brought into that discussion, and you would hope that they are, rather than it becoming a contract to a big organization, a big consulting company who's going to go off and do this research, because it's a waste of money. We don't need to spend the money figuring out how to do it when we have that knowledge and expertise that exists in this sector, in this industry already. And so it would seem short-sighted to not make it collaborative in that way, and to invest in almost reinventing the wheel, because there's lots here that does already exist that can be supported by much more smaller and more agile. Let's not forget that's a massive challenge often for these big organizations. They lack the agility, which is what the much smaller innovators have and has been behind their success. So it would be sad, worse than sad. It would be, really detrimental, I think, to not just the space that we occupy, but healthcare as a whole, if that was the road that we go down, I think.
You're pointing there to something, Jessica, and sort of what way you describe it, into its agility and otherwise, but also the engagement with patients and with public and some solutions. And maybe that can also be a differentiator, right? I mean, a lot of the things that have been announced in the plan, I mean, they major on the technology. They make a lot of assumptions around how that also leads to change, how that leads to benefits. But we know that around a lot of these things, if you don't really invest in the design and the change and the engagement with people, how they actually behave and act, then the technology itself is not going to make a difference, right? The single patient record by itself won't make any difference. It's all about how information is being given to people at the right time, at the right moment to actually act on. Seeing your record in the app will make no difference unless you really test with people what information they actually respond to. Trying to monitor long-term conditions to the app, the same, right? It's much more around that interaction between technology and people, and otherwise. And so I think a potential differentiator is being able to demonstrate how that connection is understood and already much better cracked. It'd be very easy for a lot of tech companies to say, like, oh, we can present information like this, because that becomes easier and easier with the standards. But actually being able to say, we can't just present the information, we are also good at, or the best at, understanding of how people actually interact with it. We've got the evidence, we've done the design, we've got the detail behind that. Because I hope, and from some things that John Mackey has said around, sort of realizing the benefits from EPR and seeing the results of technology, not just the technology, that the approach is less about what's the tech we're going to buy now, and more about who is best at solving the problem that we're trying to solve. I mean, I wouldn't put my hand in fire from the 10-year plan alone that the sort of that shift towards problem that is there, but I've certainly heard some of the language around it, including from the NHS, is much more focused on, is it actually solving a problem in that way.
I'm just looking at the list of my choices, my specialist, my consult, my medicines, my vaccines, my care, my health, my companion, my children, my carer. Right.
I wrote them all out earlier. I love a list. I really enjoyed doing it, but they've thought about that a lot.
And the thing is, I look at this and I can see segments of the market out there. Now, look, like I totally, I'm a fan of creative disruption, right? I feel that the most healthy power in health tech that we can have is a way of being able to harness and coordinate creative disruption, right? We need a market to be able to work to innovate so we can help raise each other and compete. And one of the challenges we've always had with centralization is its stagnation. As soon as you give one supplier the contract for something, that the competition dies. There is no competition, and they sluggishly drag themselves through something. And I look at sort of like, let's pick one, for example, my care, managing long-term conditions, right? So again, not going to name any suppliers, but logistically, there's a whole number of companies that have been working over the years to develop things for rehabilitation and certain areas around this and getting better, and inhaler technique videos and all kinds of, there's ones who are kind of working on the back end of structuring pieces of information to do better forms of engagement. And, if we think about referral services and stuff, there's a market that's been, building up over the years. I'm being very careful because I don't want to, on this podcast, almost suggest that certain segments have got a problem. But I can't help but think if they've come and they've done it and they've helped to lead this, and I've seen this in previous years, like particularly with how the Wayfinder and the NHS app team kind of guarded the castle, right? And they let some in and others didn't, and then they really struggled, right? I just worry that maybe they go and do a consultation, they get all the ideas from these companies, and then again, they go and pay a big tech company to go and deliver it. And then these companies can't compete with the central thing. They can't do it. Let's chuck in the portals. Let's chuck in some of these other areas, that we've got in the market. Now, maybe as a taxpayer, there is an argument that actually the best value that maybe we get is that a government can centrally push and lowball. But the only thing that I would say on this is that I feel that the biggest, strongest vision that we have had for the application of technology over the last couple of decades is the iPhone and Android, right? Where we have built clear rules to be able to modularize things in. And my concern, and there is nothing that has said this, but my concern is that the half-hammed way that we've kind of tried to do this quite badly in the center and, has led to some people saying, well, that doesn't work and it's a failure and we can't have modularization because it's just technologically sprawled. And I feel that's one of those areas where maybe it's yet again another example in the NHS where we've tried something, haven't done it properly, and then kind of written it off as not possible. And again, this is me totally operating in conjecture here, but I just look at all of these my things and I think, what happens to these companies that have built this out now? Do we just get rid of them? Like, or do they get a shot? Do they get a shot? Do they get to be involved? Is there a way that you can have multiple suppliers that can fit through these? So different kinds of organizations, because also care isn't monocultural as well, right? Sorry, I'm really in ranty territory, but like community health organizations to primary care, to mental health, to different, you just go in one community health organization, there's 42 different kinds of services that support people with different kinds of needs, often complex, right? Are we going to have one size fits all that supports all of these things? Like, you take the laws of integration, you can't do a great job for everybody with one thing. And you can't do, so I don't know, like it just worries. And again, this is the fact that we don't have the detail and the spec and stuff like that. But I don't know, I worry about the philosophy that sits behind all of this. I don't want to be a worry monger, but I'm worried and I'm mongering. So there.
And they're important questions to ask.
So, Liam, do you think that one can evolve out of the other? I can sort of see why right now the focus on the app is a very central place, particularly from a perspective of making sure that everyone can access certain minimum functionality. There's aspects around how data is being presented where maybe at this point we're not quite ready in terms of interoperability, data standards, et cetera, to open it up completely. But as that evolves and improves, you could see a world where actually all the sort of my this, my that becomes a much more open environment, and where the concept of the app actually sort of fades away, because what it actually becomes is your ability to make your data available to any type of app that consolidates what's in your, by that point, single patient record. The same way we now see it in the finance industry. What I don't know, because I'm not a tech expert, is to what extent there's really important sort of procurement or tech stack decisions to make now that keep that future open, rather than close it down, which is why I'm asking that sort of question.
Like, all I can take is what I read in the report, and there was nothing that suggested around sort of a modularized, like they didn't talk about, like previously when Tim Ferriss was in role, sorry, and again for listeners who are like, who the hell is Tim Ferriss? When Tim Ferriss came in, and they changed the previous view about the NHS app, because historically the NHS app was like, we'll get to do two things and it'll be amazing, and then everyone realized that two things isn't amazing, and then it wasn't really doing enough, and then obviously we had COVID, and then suddenly it was like, we need to turn this into an ecosystem, and the vision was there, and I was like, yes, finally, great, they're clicking on it. And then we've had a lot going on, and now we've gone back into this new plan, and I haven't read anything that has told me that we can have a set of standards for genuinely good integration, and then we can sort of lead to this, right? And I think everything that I have read, however, like let's get one virtual ward solution across the country. There's a whole market of virtual ward solutions out there. What happens to the rest of them? They dead? And is that the central philosophy here, that what we do is we maybe create a market, then we'll have a period where we go, okay, everyone's finished, pick a winner at this moment in time, and the rest of you can bugger off. Like, it's this kind of stuff that's about, and look, the NHS isn't about making markets, but given we're talking about the UK economy here, given we're talking about UK PLC and exportability of solutions and so on, this is not important, right?
Yeah, I guess the question you're asking is how do you build these initiatives while also having an eye to what a vibrant market looks like, both from a growth perspective, but also in terms of future development and evolution of technologies beyond, the sort of current set of features that we want.
One glimmer, that I spotted, and this might be naivety or just me completely misinterpreting. Goodness me, Liam, you were talking about brain fog. I'm still suffering from brain fog. Interpretizing, that's a word, okay? I might have interpreted it wrong. One of the things that it did mention under this app work stream, let's call it, or under the app, is this selection or library of features known as this health store. They've described it as enabling innovative businesses to work more collaboratively, can't say any words today, collaboratively with the NHS and regulators. And again, we don't have the details, so it's really hard to know, but I wonder if that is a signal that to allowing, let's call it a marketplace, but more of a store of places where people are able to select features that suit them. However, I think to counter my own point, one of the things that then I think pushes you in the other direction is that you have this, as we've just laughed about, this long list of different functions that the app is going to serve, which actually then supersedes some of what would necessarily be in there. So it's until they actually bring out the detail and the plan for what that looks like and who is able to get into that health store and how that supplements what's going to be part of the core service of the app, it's really difficult to tell. But I can completely appreciate why that is creating fear, because you can have companies who are sat there wondering, as you say, are we going to be around in 2 years' time, or should we just give up on the UK market and head off to France or Australia or somewhere else entirely that is going to appreciate us?
I don't know how much fear there is at the moment. This is my fear as opposed to what I'm reading in others, right? Because I think a lot of people in the tech industry might be like, oh, here's these fancy shiny things, those who haven't been around the block for a couple of decades in this system and become salty beasts, sort of maybe harnessing in their expectation and not sort of subscribing to everything they're being promised. I don't know, so maybe they're not feeling fear, maybe they're feeling really positive. Maybe I should shut up and be more positive because we need more people being positive, and actually maybe I shouldn't be saying all this thing I'm saying at the moment. But yeah, I'm just reading about the App Store here. Right.
There are hints of what you're talking about though, Liam, already, aren't there? Like things like, with the kind of centralization approach and the kind of appetite for that kind of one dominant player or, a couple of dominant players. Like the FDP is a great example of what happens when the centre says, let's pick a large supplier and do it at the national level. And there's a lot of, it's being done too, but I think it's very clear that when you do take that national approach, people do resist. There is quite a bit of resistance still now and alternative solutions, and let's push back because we're already using something and for our local needs, it works better. So
everyone dreams of a national approach, right? Until they realise what a national approach might mean for them.
Yeah.
I've got 500k in the bank and 7 people working for my organisation. We'd love a central approach until they realise that the central approach is never going to pick them, right? So
yeah.
But I guess with that, I mean, it is a plan that has a lot of nods to, there are startups like there are a lot of companies not named in this plan, but very much referred to in their case studies. And that goes on through so many case studies in this and plans that come before it. But it does feel like so many of the ideas come from the startup world. It would be very hard when these kind of national approaches come around and someone says, oh, we could build something similar. It's to your point. It's, are these the best people at solving the problem? When they have solved these problems before, can we just take ideas from startup world and ignore them all?
And also, how many national projects have been scrapped and you'd be laughed out the room, surely. The number of times we've had these lofty aspirations and then years and years process of bringing it into action, and then it's around for a little bit, if it even gets to actuality, and then it's then relegated to a dusty filing cabinet and is the butt of jokes.
Yeah, but maybe this also goes back to the sort of the point I was trying to make, that that real clear sense of where is it the right thing nationally to procure something or to run it, because we actually consider it as a national infrastructure, a public good ultimately. And whatever we think about the ins and outs of how electronic health records being procured and sort of implemented, that's clearly a case in point.
Yeah.
And you could definitely see the rationale there, and I think some would argue that it could be even more, sort of centralized than it sort of is than it is at the moment. Versus those area where you intentionally want to support the evolutionary side of it and leaving it much more iterative and letting it develop and maybe learn together and set out what good looks like and set clear national expectations that everyone should now be able to use this kind of technology to provide this type of service, digitally or remote first, whatever it looks like, but sort of leave it open. And it feels like that conversation could be really helpful. In some of that.
It's been I guess primary care has experienced quite a bit of that recently with that you must be achieving the standard, you must be able to deliver a service that resembles these providers, the service that these providers will support. But it still feels like, and a lot of this will inevitably come down to how does the funding actually reach there. It's the delivery piece, isn't it? It's just, you must achieve this, how you achieve it, what solution you pick, up to you in a sense. But there's been a real challenge actually marrying that up with all the other major priorities that go on. And I'd like to think I'm actually quite optimistic about this report in that it does kind of address some of those like challenges in the round, rather than just being like, here is money for AI, here is money for this. Like, I feel like we've been having drip feed announcements of funding for nebulous things for a while. So it is nice to see this is how technology fits into that problem. And this is how, like, looking forward over the next 10 years, this is how we envision the technologies that are available or that we think are going to be or getting there, or, at that point, this is how that kind of works in and how we're going to streamline things into that alongside the kind of wider issue you're trying to solve. And I think that's, for me, where the kind of reasons to be optimistic about this plan come from, which is just having some kind of concrete view of, yeah, okay, we are going to use technology. This is what we'd like to use it for. This is the bets we are making in terms of the like arrangement and organization of the service as well, and including some of the funding. And I know I'll probably text Liam later and just ask for his views on capital spend and all of the finance chapter, because
it's great.
Be far too boring.
I think it's a really welcome move. I think it's the most interesting thing. I think it's the thing that companies should be most excited about, actually. The fact that we can look beyond 1 year, or from next year we'll be able to look beyond 1 year and be able to start actually, particularly around things like prevention and so on. I think it's one of the last things that people will look at, and they won't get the difference between cap and rev and stuff like that. But actually, that's what kills so many businesses at the moment. That's what kills so many innovations actually happening and transformations. So, like, to me, I'm super positive about the fact that someone's actually had the guts to really break this thing that has been holding everyone back for a long time. Like, thinking about future care for people in a system that can only think within single years, like as Patricia Hewitt said in 2023, she identified it as one of the biggest things that needed to be fixed.
Hugh, I agree with the optimism there. I think about the sort of the step forward that the report makes on that, and it talks a lot around adoption, which is music to my ears, because a lot of the work we've been doing at the Health Foundation is exactly around that. But I continue still to worry to what extent. To what extent is the follow through really going to be that if there is an expectation for new technology, or indeed funding, so for new technology, that it actually comes with the funding for the for the change capacity, for the evaluation, for the learning. There's quite a big gap still between where we are today, where like 4 out of 5 pounds on innovation are basically spent on new ideas and not on implementing existing ones. Nowhere near enough money goes into evaluation compared to sort of R&D and research budgets when it comes to implementation evaluation, rather than big impact evaluations. And I think we need to sort of see a couple of big signals where some of the money, whether it's part of the 10 billion that's been announced for tech as part of the spending review, which was clear was both revenue and capital, but I think we need to see a bit of a signal that the language around implementation and adoption is going to be followed through. And I also think that's the only way in which you will be able to address maybe some of the cynicism that's crept in from some NHS staff around tech over the last few years, because often it's been seen as the implementation of a piece of kit, and then a bit of training, and it might have actually made it worse than before, or duplicated things. And often that is because it's not coming with the attention and the funding and the focus on change to actually get people to use it and get the benefits out of it, etc. So, and again, ambient scribes, I think, are a great example. Like if we actually pursue that in a way that we make sure that everywhere where it's implemented, we give it the best possible support, that people actually do save time from it, and that their working day has become easier, and that the patient enjoys the consultation more, that's awesome. But that's more than just a framework for buying ambient scribes, right? That goes back to, you need that community, you need that exchange. Anyway, we'll try that out, but I think we need that for every piece of new technology or change that we're going to introduce. And yeah, I want to see more on that still. I want those signals.
There's such a gap, and I do think this is the weakness of some of these reports, is that for everything I find in there to be optimistic, there's sentences that just make me crack up. All of this information, all of this detail, all this great stuff on capital, and then there is a genuine sentence in there about, by the end of this plan, every hospital in England will be fully AI enabled. And I have no idea what that means.
I was going to say, have we defined what that means? I think we're still struggling to define exactly what we mean by AI. So AI enabled would be an even greater feat.
And it's just one of those, like, yeah, okay, I see where you're going with it, but it's a statement. It's not an end. It's not an outcome. It's not a map.
It's not a measurable objective, is it?
Although, to borrow from James yesterday, who's our absent friend, right? Like, he kind of pushed, he pushed on me, because Roy Lilly, a guy that a lot of people in the NHS follow, kind of described the 10-year plan as a brochure, right? I quite enjoy that. And like, actually, like, we do kind of need a brochure for the future. We do kind of need to see where we're going. And actually, like, do you know what? Like, sometimes, like, when people said, like, when we've had big missions in the past and we haven't known exactly what it takes to get to that, right? To get to what AI enabled might be. I don't know, like, I'm just reeling back from some of my specific areas of cynicism, but like, actually, maybe we do need people to say, well, this is what's happening. We're going in this direction. Like, we've got to work out what that means. And maybe we've got to kind of fill in the blanks on what AI enabled means on this, because like, I'm sorry, like, like, I know that we probably put these individuals who are writing the plan on pedestals, but like, don't know, like, in a different life, it could have very easily been you and me, Malte, writing parts of these plans, right? If we'd so, and I just look at, I don't think they know any more than a lot of us do. I don't think they have any better vision of the future, and maybe they need to kind of say, we're going to Mars and we don't really know exactly what that is going to be, right? But maybe there's, we've seen this week about a lack of vulnerability again in our leaders and us not accepting it. But actually, like, I don't know, the strongest form of leadership I've ever seen in organizations is where people say, I think this is where we need to get to. I think this is where we need to cohere around a vision. And I don't know all the answers. And I don't know, and to be honest, there was a lot. I think they could have put a bit more don't know and a little bit more, maybe they would have got slammed for it and that's an unreal expectation, but a little less around we will in that convincing language that penetrated the whole document.
Yeah, and maybe if it comes with, sort of setting that direction to give a bit more leeway and permission and particularly support when it comes to the risk culture to NHS leaders, practitioners, to say, like, look, we the plan says we want to be digital first, so I'm going to try something that is generally digital first, and and I actually have more opportunity to try that than maybe I've been so far, because that sort of direction has never quite been set out. Like it's about time we're going to have the first proper virtual hospital, right? Like fully virtual in that way. And I think until now, anyone who wanted to try that in the NHS would have felt very, very scared for all the sort of reasons. But maybe setting out that sort of vision can unlock that a little bit more. I'd be interested to see what these innovation zones are meant to do, because they're meant to give a lot of permission and opportunity between life science industry, integrated care boards and sort of others. Maybe that can be a space. But if that sort of vision element can then also translate in people being allowed to try more things, rather than, as you say, you will be doing X and you will be doing Y, which is right on maybe a handful of national things, but can't be the answer to how this looks like in detail for every neighborhood health service, for example, then that could become quite powerful over time if it comes with that culture shift.
All right. Well, I'm mindful of time, and I'm mindful. I want to give something apart from, a great conversation to our listeners. So I know from personal experience, I am not very good in sitting in ambiguity and waiting for the detail, for the plans, and I like to be in control of things. And I guess it goes without saying that, we've talked a lot about this plan being a vision, and that there are things missing, which is part of that is a delivery. And we're kind of watching and waiting until we have the detail and an understanding of what the delivery looks like. But what is your advice to people in the industry who are reading this plan, wondering what the next 10 years is going to look like for them in their profession, whether they're clinical, whether they're on the innovation side, wherever they might sit? What is your advice while we sit out and wait?
I mean, maybe that's the obvious thing to say, right? But this is now the sort of the leading light for any NHS and government decisions going forward, right? At least within this parliament. And so being able to very, very clearly respond either to the problems that have been set out in it or the ambitions that have been set out in it, I think is the next most important space. I think for some that might just mean slightly rehashing an articulation that sort of works the same. But for others, it might be a more fundamental redescription of what is the problem that we're trying to solve and the ambition to make. So I think in the short term, that's the single most important sort of shift or bit to engage with, and do it generally, not just slightly rewrite the description of the product and say yeah it sort of does this. I think it's important to really demonstrate how it makes, let's say, neighborhood health services reality or other aspects that are being articulated.
So firstly, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Plan. I was kind of going for the order of the AI mix. I said, this is what we've been thinking about throughout the whole podcast. I'll be thinking about this over the weekend as well. Look, what I'd say is that, for those who haven't been through a reform before or something like this, like there is a period after the first part where there is a sense check and there is an iteration and stuff like that. And there always kind of has been. What I would say is that I think often, and I'm speaking to the listeners of the Healthtech podcast here, a lot of companies have really struggled, have basically tried to push for self-interest rather than trying to think about the collective best needs and the best options. And so, I think now is the time for a discussion, but it can't just be about everybody shouting in their own silo about things. And I think, what I think we need to have is that, I just really desperately hope that after the kind of everything is awesome years under the Tories, where it was really hard to push back and to challenge things. We've opened the Pandora's box of Darcy. Darcy's box is open, right? So in which case, let's just try and maintain the spirit of actually having open and frank discussions and using public platforms to do it. They never existed in previous ones in the same way it did now. And most of the NHS and NHS leaders have got on it, probably because they're trying to work out where their next job is, a lot of them, right? So I think we've got an online NHS and we have some ways where actually we can kind of make sure that we can enforce that this is a discussion, and again, with great organisations like the Health Foundation, the King's Fund and Nuffield and stuff like that as well. I think we need to all kind of try and come together and think about compromise and try and really push hard and advocate for something that's sensible. Because if we just take the big bosses up top have given us the answer and we've just got to live or die or get that, no one's going to win. No one's going to win in that circumstances. So I don't know. I'm a grassroots boy, and it's all about the grassroots to me. And I just think, how do we find common interest grassroots?
That was beautiful, guys. Appreciated that. Thank you. What a gift! What a gift to our listeners. And for the final gift that I would like to leave them with, we are Healthtech Pigeon, and so to close out, if you were to describe this plan as an animal, what would it be? We've already had the Harry Potter title, so
yeah, a chameleon.
I back you both.
A chameleon, okay. Because it can be many different colors and spots to many different people depending on where you put it or which page you open.
Very sensible. I love it, but also very accurate.
I can't decide between an eagle and a mole, you know? A mole because it was kind of made in the dark and no one got to see it, and then it just came out, right? I suppose the eagle is
squinting into the daylight.
Yeah, I suppose on the eagle it's kind of it's much more future facing. It's really looking quite far ahead in the distance, and there's a few things that aren't necessarily there in terms of that. So I'll give you one of those two. I think Malte's is better though, to be honest. Like chameleon is better. Yeah.
Well, you heard it here first. The NHS 10-year plan is a chameleon mole, and don't worry about reading it. That's all you need to know. Awesome. Well, apologies to our listeners who are not from the UK, but this has been taking up a lot of headspace for us this week, and it's been an important conversation to have. I'm delighted to be joined by you both. Thank you so much for guiding us through so expertly and allowing us to have something of a debate as well. Much appreciated, and see you again really soon.
Fantastic. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.